Perhaps no tribe on the North American continent instilled as much fear and inspired as much legend as the Comanche. Their empire spanned from Texas to Kansas to Colorado to New Mexico, covering virtually the whole of America's southern plains. This was arguably the most bountiful hunting ground on the plains, as it was rife with vast herds of buffalo. But they did not acquire these lands easily. In their expansive warrior history, the Comanche have battled against any and all intruders into their lands, and have earned a reputation amongst their foes as an absolutely irascible enemy. Tonight, join History at the OK Corral as we examine some of the most brutal and little-known battles in the long and storied history of Comanche warfare.
Southern Colorado, 1828. On the sparse expanses of the vast Great Plains, the Comanche chief Bull Hump surveys the dusk landscape. With a discernible glint of excitement in his eyes, he scans the surroundings. His ears listen intently as the younger Comanche warriors whom he has sent out as scouts report their findings to him. And their findings are promising. Only hours earlier, this haughty band of mostly young Comanche warriors had ridden into the area that fur trader William Bent has recently begun constructing and what will come to be known colloquially as Bent's Fort. Bent has been inspired to begin construction on the compound-like area due to its ideal location at the mouth of the Huerfano River. This makes it a hub for local trading activity, and the Comanche, assured in both their growing martial and economic prowess, have strode into the area under the unofficial leadership of Bull Hump, a veteran warrior and affluent trader himself. Though they are notoriously bellicose in nature, the Comanche have spent the preceding few years ensconced in a bitter conflict with their northerly neighbors, the Cheyenne. Though it is generally proffered that the Comanche were relegated to the vast expanses of the southern plains that encompass the area from present-day northern Mexico to Kansas, it is argued by George Bird Grinnell in his work The Fighting Cheyenne that their area of influence, and very likely their area of occupancy during the 1820s, was far wider than understood by present-day ethnographers. He writes, "When the Cheyenne began to work west and southwest from the Missouri River, they found the country occupied by the Kiowas, and the people whom they call, when they are in the mountains, the Shoshone, and on the plains, Skiskini wo Istaniu, or Snake People, the Comanches." The Cheyenne recognize the extremely close relationship which exists between these two tribes of the mountains and the plains, and say that the Shoshone ought to be called mountain snakes or mountain Comanches. The Comanches, they say, range from the Yellowstone River south to beyond the Platte. Grinnell continues, "The wide range of the Shoshone stock on the plains has perhaps not yet been fully appreciated. I believe that at the time of the migration southward of the Blackfeet, the Snakes or the Shoshone occupied much plains territory from the St. Mary's River in Montana and British America southward, perhaps to the Yellowstone. As late as 1840, the mountain Shoshone used to make their war excursions out on the plains of the north, and a war party of them once came as far south as Bent's Fort, where, during a quarrel arising from their insistence that they should be admitted within the fort at an inopportune time, one of them was killed. Some of the writers on the Plains tribes seem not to have understood the close relationship of the Shoshone and the Comanche, and persons who are not aware that the Comanche were reported in the 18th century as ranging in Texas and Mexico perhaps have not realized that people of the same blood and speaking the same language may have lived at the time on the northern plains under another name. A realization of that fact may serve to clear up some apparent confusions. I believe in the matter of the relationships of the tribes who lived about him, the Indian was a much better ethnologist than the early trapper, trader, or missionary who wrote books upon the West, which he had just ventured into, and whose people and products were absolutely new to him. Though the exact date of the first conflict between the Cheyenne and the Comanche is unclear, the reason behind their conflict is, for the most part, easily discernible. This area of the southern plains is not only a central locale for several valuable trade routes, it is a prime territory for the massive buffalo herds whom most plains tribes depend on nearly entirely for their sustenance and survival. By the mid-1820s, countless bloody, tragic, and terrible atrocities had been wrought on both sides of the conflict in the interest of expansion and, just as significantly, retribution. Now, believing their hated enemy to be somewhere near this current location, Bullhump and his warriors have spent the entire afternoon scouring the area in search of any sign that the Cheyenne might be present. Assured that their enemy is somewhere within the immediate vicinity, Bullhump and several of the more experienced warriors questioned William Bent as to when he had last seen the Cheyenne and from which direction they had come. Bent, doubtless at least slightly intimidated by the potential consequences of his answer, responds that he has seen a sizable party of Cheyenne a few days earlier, coming from the northeast. Bullhump and his cohorts now confer on the best course of action to follow. They all agree that the opportunity to execute a surprise raid on their hated enemy is one that is all but impassable. Not only is there the opportunity for blood debts to be settled, but the economic prize presented by the Cheyenne's sizable horse herd renders their village an irresistible target to the Comanche warriors. After the sun has finally set, a small group of scouts is sent out to determine the exact location of the Cheyenne village. Operating under the cover of darkness, the men soon return, reporting that the village lies only a few miles down the tributary of the Flat River known as Bijou Creek. The camp is too large to merit a head-on attack, a strategy that would lead to needless Comanche deaths. Thus, it is decided that their focus will be on absconding with the sizable horse herd the Cheyenne village has at its disposal. As alluded to in his work Empire of the Summer Moon, author S.C. Gwynn adroitly likens the theft of horses in the Old West to the act of stealing thousands of dollars from a modern-day ATM in one fell swoop. Their intentions now set, the full party of Comanche raiders moves out sometime after midnight, slipping silently across the prairie and creek beds until arriving at the Cheyenne village. Without hesitation, the experienced warriors sneak into place, surrounding the horse herd while taking care not to alert the young Cheyenne boys charged with being on watch. In short order, the air is filled with Comanche war whoops, and hundreds of frightened Cheyenne ponies now charge away from the village, their stampede being directed by strategically placed Comanche cutting off their potential escape routes. Soon, Bullhump and his proud band of Comanche are themselves back in camp, now surrounded by their newly begotten horse herd, and assured that the Cheyenne, now all on foot, have no means with which to pursue them. But, unbeknownst to Bullhump and his warriors, and to William Bent for that matter, the legendary Cheyenne chief, Yellow Wolf, has been away from the large village with a sizable contingent of young warriors. They have been out gathering wild horses, vestiges of the larger population of horses that have been continually working their way northward via trade and migration. Though it is the middle of the night, the warriors are eager to make their way home and intend on arriving near dawn. As they move, one of the warriors near the front of the herd rides back towards Yellow Wolf. He reports that the men at the front all concur that they smell the distinct aroma of burning buffalo chips. The chips, made of dried buffalo dung, are the main source of fire fuel on the timberless plains, and the smell of their smoke is indicative that another tribe is in the area. A contingent of Cheyenne scouts is sent out to investigate, and they return in short order to report that they have found an encampment of several Comanche warriors in possession of what the Cheyenne recognize to be their own horse herd. Yellow Wolf directs a portion of his men to stay with the horses they currently have, while he leads the majority cut off the Comanche's egress southwards onto the plains. The Cheyenne follow their scouts back to the site of the Comanche camp, where Bullhump and his warriors are resting until daybreak before moving their herd of stolen horses again. Yellow Wolf now brings his men to a halt, and directs them to wait until daybreak before making their charge upon the Comanche camp. He instructs the younger warriors, among whom is his beloved stepson, Walking Coyote, to rush upon the horse herd and drive them away from the Comanche and back towards their village. Finally, as the sun breaks the eastern horizon, the Cheyenne make their final approach upon the Comanche camp. They are pleased to see the Comanche who have been on guard of the horse herd throughout the night have momentarily gone into the camp with their cohorts to eat breakfast and prepare for the day's travel. Seeing that the time to strike is now, Yellow Wolf and his warriors advance in silence, walking their horses as close as possible to the camp before erupting in a cacophony of war cries as they drive the horse herd away from the Comanche village and back towards their own. Almost instantly, the Comanche reprisal comes as arrows fill the air, flying towards the Cheyenne. Seeing a chance to seize a battlefield honor, Walking Coyote, the stepson of Yellow Wolf, charges back into the very thick of the Comanche encampment where their finest horses had been picketed down for the night. Seeing one particularly fine mount, Walking Coyote jumps from his own horse cuts the rope picketing the prized horse, jumps back on his own horse, and rides back towards his Cheyenne comrades, leading the new horse away via the rope. When Walking Coyote rejoins his fellow Cheyenne, he triumphantly hands the lead rope of the newly reclaimed horse to his stepfather, Yellow Wolf. But rather than overjoyous pride, the young warrior sees only growing concern in the chief's eyes. Then he looks back himself to see the Comanche in hot pursuit. The Comanche, mounted on their finest horses, are now approaching at such speed that the Cheyenne are sure to be overtaken. Yellow Wolf now barks out the order that all who have guns must turn back and charge on them. That is the only hope we have of getting away from them. We must fight them. Yellow Wolf being in possession of a fine rifle himself, he leads the charge. Without hesitation, the Cheyenne with guns wheel their horses around, follow their leader in a head-on attack towards the pursuing Comanche. Within moments, they smash into the group of Comanche, numbering about 25 warriors in total, and a vicious close-quarters fight unfolds. Yellow Wolf rides up next to a Comanche warrior, sticks the barrel of his rifle into the warrior's ribcage, and expels the man's innards in a torrent of viscera as he falls to the ground with a thud. Walking Coyote, riding close behind, counts coup on the fallen warrior. As more Comanche begin to fall, a retreat is made, and the pursuing force returns to their cohorts at the main Comanche camp, from which a full retreat is made. The dead Comanche are summarily scalped, and Yellow Wolf affixes the hair of the warrior he has killed on the end of his rifle barrel. The Cheyenne ride back into their camp to the great surprise and adulation of their kinsmen, wives, and children. The Cheyenne camp, awash only hours before in hopelessness, is now a site of great revelry, as the people have gained back not only their stolen horses, but the newly gotten wild horses and the Comanche mounts as well. In 1840, a peace would be made between the Cheyenne and the Comanche, and Bull Hump would recall the raid and explain that he and his warriors had believed, quite rightly, the Cheyenne would be heading back to their camp, and seeing as how the Cheyenne camp was now a far more formidable target, they had chosen to fight another day. Such was the way of warfare on the plains, a highly mobile, fluid, and violent affair with battles that took place countless times throughout history, the vast majority of which have gone unrecorded. And while you can rest assured that there are many other accounts of intertribal warfare on the open plains, those, for tonight, are other stories for other times. Southwestern Oklahoma, 1848. In the middle of the night, deep in the Wichita Mountains, a small village of Comanche lies quiet, with almost all of its inhabitants deep in slumber. Inside of a warm teepee, a young mother and her infant son are sleeping peacefully. The woman's name is Nauta, and she is the wife of a revered war chief named Peta Nakona. The baby boy is the couple's first child together and the apple of his parents' eye. His name is Quanah. For weeks now, since the day of his birth, Peta Nakona has fawned over his newborn son. He has bragged and boasted to his comrades about the size and strength of his boy and of the great deeds he would surely accomplish as a hunter and warrior. But on this night, Peta Nakona is miles away. He and the rest of the able-bodied warriors in the village are on the warpath. The Comanche are a mighty people who have laid claim to the most valuable real estate on the plains for roughly a century and a half by now. By this point in the late 1840s, they have subjugated or driven off virtually anyone who was opposed to them, from the Tonkawa to the Spanish to, most recently, the Texans. In doing so, they have acquired an extensive list of enemies, from the aforementioned adversaries in the Spanish, Texans, and Tonkawas to itinerant Mexican farmers and American fur traders. The Comanche had not hesitated to inflict horrific damages in order to sustain their territories in the southern plains. The afternoon prior to this evening, Peta Nakona had assembled his band of raiders, and the party had headed west. This group is largely composed of warriors from the Nokoni or Wanderers Band, and likely includes a few members from other bands as well as their longtime allies, the Kiowa. Their intention is to engage a Navajo war party that has been spotted in the area. Their conflict with the Navajo is one of their oldest, longest-running feuds, and the Comanche warriors bristle at the thought that their territory is being encroached upon.
The warring between tribes, though often unrecorded, was often fraught with atrocities and horrific losses. The fight for resources and territory was as constant as the battle against the elements and starvation. A vicious, seemingly unbreakable cycle of grievance and vengeance often held rival tribes at odds for decades. Raiding was seen as a cultural pastime, perhaps even a cultural necessity, by most tribes on the continent. It was viewed as a perfectly honorable pursuit to find the nearest village of a longtime enemy and sweep down upon them in a torrent of violence. The killing of males was generally to be expected, but women and children were often not exempt from such horrific, violent ends. Those not killed immediately could expect, at best, to be adopted into the tribe that had just decimated their families. The worst they could expect was a torturous end that would later be spoken of in feared, hushed tones around the campfires of pioneers, Texas Rangers, and Army soldiers. Those raids might come at any time, though generally they slowed during the winter. Should a village be caught unprepared, it could find itself snuffed out by an enemy raiding force, gone as though it never existed. To be sure, this is not to say that intertribal warfare was the only interaction between tribes, as many tribes had long established relationships with their neighbors based on trade and mutual welfare. However, life for all tribes was a continual fight against privation and scarcity, one that created a quite fluid map of tribal territories and loyalties. Tribes like the Crow were driven out by the Sioux, while the Apache were driven from virtually the entirety of Texas by the Comanche. The Navajo, who referred to themselves as Dine or the people, had long warred with their Apache and Ute neighbors, but even in 1848 still held a particular disdain for the Comanche. The Navajo had descended from the Athabascan-speaking tribes of northwestern Alaska and Canada. Their ancestors, along with the ancestors of the Apache, had come down to what are the present-day states of Arizona, Utah, and New Mexico from their area of shared origin sometime in the late 1400s. They had at first existed as hunter-gatherers, but had adapted the crops and farming techniques of the Pueblo people, who had inhabited the area for centuries. Though their relationship with the Pueblo would also be fraught with contention throughout the years, the Navajo adapted quickly to their new environs by focusing on the production of the three sisters crops of corn, beans, and squash. With the arrival of the Spanish, goats and sheep became common in the American Southwest as they were a hearty protein source that could subsist on the meager grazing options available in the sparse deserts. As the Spanish continued their northward incursion from Mexico in the 1600s and 1700s, they too were subject to the same relationship of intermittent trading and raiding, as were all neighbors of the proud and powerful Dine people. Meanwhile, in Texas, the Comanche had risen to power after migrating from the northern Rockies, as a part of a Shoshone offshoot. Though they had initially been a people decidedly averse to conflict and conquest, this had all changed after meeting the North American continent's most valuable imported animal, the horse. They had ascended to prominence in a matter of decades, and gone from perpetually impoverished to ruthlessly enterprising. In the 1700s, the Comanche had realized the great profits that tribes like the Utes were making in trading slaves to the Spanish as well as other tribes. They had, in fact, united with the Utes for a time and wrought havoc upon the Navajo, the Jicarilla Apache, and the Lipan Apache. These brutal slave raids were carried out with the same ruthless efficiency as were raids for slaves in Africa and South America. Countless times for decades on end, terrified and traumatized people, mostly women and children, would be bargained and bartered for in remote locales on the New Mexico frontier. The Comanche had, in fact, been so feared by the Navajo that the master Spanish diplomat, Juan Bautista de Anza, had used them as an intimidation tactic while bargaining with the Navajo. In early 1786, the Spaniard had managed to, miraculously, come to a peace agreement with the Comanche. Terms were agreed upon that were acceptable to both parties, and a time of peaceable coexistence with the Comanche, a once unthinkable feat but a few years before, began. Only a few weeks after this agreement, de Anza had prudently used his newly minted allies to surprise the Navajo chiefs who had come to visit him to discuss preliminary terms for a potential peace agreement of their own. When De Anza informed the visiting Navajos that the Comanche were now his personal friends, the message to the Navajo was implicit. Should they not agree to halt their own raiding of De Anza's outpost, they could expect a visit from their much-dreaded enemy. Peace terms were subsequently agreed upon, and for a time, a period of socio-political stasis on the southern plains was, at least to some degree, achieved. The Comanche also referred to themselves as the people, in their language, Namernu. They viewed themselves through a lens of unabashed superiority, and their enemies as something less than, worthy of neither pity nor mercy should they intrude upon Comanche land or offend Comanche sensibilities. However, their bloodline is one of the most diverse on record amongst native peoples on the North American continent. This is due to the Comanche penchant for adopting a portion of the captives that they stole. Many times over the preceding centuries, at remote locations on the Texas frontier, families of Tonkawa, Karankawa, Lipan Apache, Mexican settlers and Texas farmers had been decimated, with their women and children often carried away, never to see their homeland or kinfolk again. Those not sold as slaves to other tribes or New Mexico traders would often end up as fully fledged members of the Comanche. This could be a relatively seamless process with young children who would simply be raised as Comanche. However, oftentimes the process for adoption into the tribe was a harrowing, lengthy, and arduous process. For their first weeks or even months with the tribe, the newly acquired captives would be made to do the least desirable jobs in camp, from cleaning buffalo hides to tending horse herds. This had been the fate of Nautda, the young mother who now lies with her infant, deeply ensconced in this Comanche stronghold in the Wichita Mountains. She had been born in Crawford County, Illinois, in either 1824 or 1825, to Silas and Lucinda Parker. Her birth name had been Cynthia Ann Parker. In 1833, when she was 8 or 9 years old, her grandfather, former Continental Army soldier John Parker, convinced her parents, as well as several other members of the Parker family, to immigrate to Texas. At the time, Texas was in a state of upheaval, awash in chaos and bloodshed. It was 3 years before Texas would win its independence from Mexico and establish itself as an independent republic. However, the cause of the bloodshed was not the warring of principalities, but the incessant raiding of the Comanche. The Parkers were well aware of the raiding, and had constructed a fort to protect themselves against the Comanche attacks. But on the morning of May 19, 1836, when the men were out working in the fields and the gate to the fort was wide open, the Comanche had made their attack. By this time, the Texas War for Independence from Mexico was raging, with the Battle of the Alamo having occurred only a few months earlier. With their two main contenders for Texas engaged in fighting each other, the Comanche were wreaking unfettered havoc on homesteads all across the Texas frontier. What had started out that morning at the fort as a painfully awkward exchange marked by overtures of peace by the Parkers quickly devolved into a massacre in which most of the men in the family were killed and the women and children taken prisoner. Samuel Frost, Robert Frost, Silas Parker, and Benjamin Parker were all cut down and scalped. The 77-year-old John Parker was, in what order we will never know, scalped, emasculated, and killed. The young Cynthia Ann had been taken, along with Elizabeth Kellogg, age 39, John Richard Parker, age 5, Rachel Parker Plummer, age 17, and her baby son James Pratt Plummer, age 1 year, 4 months. James Pratt Plummer would soon be killed by the Comanche due to his inability to keep quiet as they traveled. The unfortunate toddler was summarily disposed of by Comanche warriors roping him and dragging him behind their galloping horses. The rest of the Parker clan would, eventually, be returned to their family, though all would be permanently affected. Cynthia Ann, however, had been taken in by a kindly Comanche woman, who cared for her and shielded her from the sights and sounds of the physical, psychological, and sexual traumatization being inflicted upon her aunts at the hands of the Comanche captors. She had been subjected to cruel treatments initially as well, but over time had gradually become accepted by and then adopted into the tribe. Life as a Comanche woman, though, was a seemingly endless succession of chores seen as below the stature of men, whose primary roles were as hunters and warriors. While the worst jobs could be outsourced to slaves held by a woman's husband, a Comanche man often also kept multiple wives, as they were seen as little more than homekeepers and childbearers. However, by all available accounts, and by her own later recollections, Cynthia Ann loved her husband, and was very proud of his stature as a warrior and chief. She also loved her newborn boy, whose veins coursed with the blood of both Comanche chieftain and colonial soldier. Now, in her new life as Naupta, she felt protected as part of a great nation of warriors who would defend her and her children with their lives. However, on this night, both mother and child are in grave danger. Lurking in the post oaks surrounding their village are a band of Navajo raiders who have been stalking the village for days. They are the party that had been spotted by the Comanche sentries the day before. They have counted on Nacona and his warriors to charge out of the village to find them and have remained hidden in the hills with the intent of attacking the village once the majority of the warriors had left. In their blind fury, the Comanche have fallen for the ruse, and Nacona and company are miles away. However, the camp is, of course, not left unguarded. But what remains are largely teenage boys, elderly men, and warriors who are injured or otherwise unable to accompany the raiding party. The Navajo raiding party now advances upon the village, riding slowly and deliberately atop their unshod ponies. They are cloaked in darkness and intent on killing any Comanche they can find, and making off with as many of the Comanche's valuable horses as possible. As they advance, they find themselves so close to the village that they can make out the silhouettes of those still awake in their lodges. It is then, however, that the barking of the village dogs alerts the Comanche sentries on guard. These are young teens given the task of standing guard as a precursor to service as a full-fledged warrior. But they are ready and willing to do all that is necessary in defending their homes, families, and possessions. Within seconds, the loud wolf-like howls of the Comanche flood the air, awakening all within the village and sending the remaining able-bodied men flooding out of their lodges. The 16 Navajo are met with a hail of arrows and quickly reconsider their main attack on the village. Instead, the comparatively horse-poor Navajo turn their sights towards the sizable Comanche herd. As a few of the Navajo whirl about the outskirts of the village in order to distract the Comanche, the remainder are able to get away with nearly 200 of the Comanche's horses. Then, almost as quickly as they have appeared, the Navajo are gone, heading southwest at full speed. For the remainder of the night, the Comanche are left to seethe, as riders are sent out to inform Nacona's party of what has occurred. Naupta, meanwhile, has been yet again thoroughly traumatized by a raiding force of natives. Now, as she clasps her newborn tightly and waits on the return of her husband and his cohorts, one can only imagine the mix of terror and righteous indignation swirling in her heart and mind. The life she had so tediously built after the sudden and violent collapse of all she had known as a child had nearly been snuffed out at the blunt end of Navajo war clubs. In a few hours, Nacona and his warriors ride back into the village. After checking on their wives and children, the enraged party heads out on the trail of the Navajo. The fleeing Navajo know they have acquired a sizable bounty in the way of their newly seized horse herd, but the additional 200 animals also present a consequential challenge in slowing the party down drastically. The Navajo have no intention of engaging a full war party in open territory during the daylight hours, and know that their only chance in returning safely with the bounty of their raid is to beat the Comanche back to the safety of Navajo territory. They are, however, no match for the Comanche war party, who are now riding hard over ground they had known since childhood. The Navajo raiders are caught within hours, and 3 are cut down in a storm of Comanche arrows, lances, and tomahawks. The remaining 13 Navajo scatter into the west, leaving their dead comrades and stolen horses to the Comanche. Nacona and his warriors are now in a jovial mood. No Comanche has lost their life at the hands of the intruders, and they have managed to wreak just retribution on their enemies, all while reacquiring their stolen horses. Amidst great glee and whoops of joy and excitement, the Navajo warriors who have been killed are now cut to pieces. As is customary after a victory amongst almost all plains tribes, the vanquished are marred and eviscerated in hopes that the wounds will be carried into the next life as a reminder of the cost of their misdeeds. Hours later, as the sun begins to fade into the Oklahoma skyline, Peta Nocona leads his warriors back into the Comanche village. He greets his wife Nauta and holds up a long Comanche lance, to the top of which are affixed the 3 freshly taken Navajo scalps. With great joy and relief, the Comanche hold a victory dance. For 4 days, drums are beaten, songs are sung, and fires kept burning. One of the first things that the young son of Peta Nocona, Nauta, sees in his initial few weeks in this world is the sight of his father and the other warriors dancing around a large campfire in the middle of the Wichita Mountains, holding high the freshly dismembered scalps of their hated enemies. To the Comanche, it now seems they are untouchable here on the southern plain. They have driven off these intruders just as they had driven off all the others who had seen fit to challenge them for dominion over these invaluable lands. It must have seemed to Peta Nocona that his son, the young Quanah, was destined for a princely life that would see him ascend to a position even more powerful than his father, and to Nauta it must have seemed as though her former life as Cynthia Ann was a world away, something she could forget forever, as she was now part of, and party to, the lineage of the proud Comanche. But the young parents, as it would turn out, are only partially correct. In just over a decade, the world they now know will be overturned entirely. In little more than a year, the Comanche will begin to see a curious outbreak amongst their people. It starts amongst the Penateca, the southernmost and largest band of the Comanche, who live in closest proximity to the white settlements. Then, it begins to spread. The afflicted suffer from severe diarrhea and vomiting, dying of kidney failure and dehydration often within hours of being infected. The disease is known as cholera, and it will go on to kill an estimated half of the Penateca band by the 1860s. The epidemic will go on to devastate not only the Comanche, but virtually every tribe it comes into contact with. Coming on the heels of several devastating smallpox epidemics throughout the early 19th century, the demographic collapse of the lords of the southern plains was all but assured. The Comanche would also be continually pressured by the incessant influx of settlers into the burgeoning Republic of Texas. In the coming decades, they would see their territory encroached upon and taken over until they were relegated to but a small corner of their beloved homelands. Nauta would see her life upended yet again, as Texas Rangers would kill her husband and haul her and her baby off in 1860 to be returned to the Parker family. During this raid, Quanah and his little brother, a boy known as Peanuts, would escape the fighting, never to see their mother again. Quanah, for his part, would go on to become the last great chief of the Comanche. A fierce warrior and skilled diplomat, and a man who seemed perpetually caught between two worlds. But in 1848, all of this seems inconceivable to the joyous band of Comanche as they sing and chant into the night, faces alit by the flames. They are the mighty lords of the southern plains, the Nirmanu, the people, and their downfall is not yet at hand. And so for now, the many tales of the Comanche's reign over the southern plains, as well as the lives and legacies of the Navajo, Texans, Mexicans, and Americans, are all other stories for other times.
West Texas, November 1855. As the cool autumn wind whips around them, a large party of Comanche men, women, and children make their way northeast through the barren country, on their way to the seasonal roaming territory of their most important source of sustenance, the huge herds of American bison, or buffalo, that roam the Great Plains. Though their austere surroundings would be enough to drive almost any mortal being to the brink of endurance, the Comanche seem wholly unbothered as they plod their way across the open prairie. One among their party, however, is visibly bedraggled by the incessant pace, an omnipresent cloud of dust stirred up by the Comanche horses and mules. He is a captive of the Comanche, taken as a human spoil of war in their ongoing conflict with the Texas Rangers and cattle ranchers who ventured out further onto the frontier with every passing year. His name is Nelson Lee. Only months prior, he had been a member of a group of enterprising horse traders
who had been making the treacherous journey to Southern California to sell their vast herd of valuable horses and mules at a markedly higher price than they might garner in Texas, Louisiana, or east of the Mississippi. The party of 27 men had been set upon by the Comanche, and only Nelson Lee, William Aikens, Thomas Martin, and Jonathan Stewart had managed to survive. Aikens and Lee had been forced to watch as Martin and Stewart were subjected to vicious, hours-long torture killings at the hands of the Comanche. They had then been divided up amongst the war chiefs, and Lee had been designated as a slave to the renowned warrior Spotted Leopard. Lee will be relegated to the menial tasks of completing chores in camp, as well as the gory, stinking work of skinning and gutting the hulking buffalo that are harvested. His only hopes for survival are to comply with his captors in the Comanche, though the nearly unbearable pangs of loneliness and isolation incessantly tear at his psyche. Lee's experience is not entirely unique on the Texas frontier. For decades now, across the whole of central Texas, entire families have been killed or carried off, and entire farmsteads laid waste to by Comanche raiders intent on driving out any and all intruders from their hard-won lands. This policy is not necessarily driven as much by racial motives as it is by cultural ones, as the Comanche reserve the same treatment for any and all of their enemies, be they Anglo-Texans, Tejanos, Mexicans, Americans, Spanish, or members of rival tribes like the Tonkawa, Caddo, and Cheyenne. The Comanche have risen to prominence in this harsh land after migrating southward from the northern ranges of the Rocky Mountains after acquiring the horse in the 17th century. In the ensuing time period, they had swept through the southern plains and wrested virtually the whole of Texas from the control of perhaps their most hated enemy, the Apache. Though the vast majority of their encounters on the open expanses of the frontier have gone unrecorded in the annals of Western posterity, the results of the sheer brutality of this conflict were on clear display to the Spanish friars who inhabited the Catholic mission of San Saba, near today's town of the same name. Here, the resident priests saw what amounted to veritable hordes of Apache fleeing into the confines and comparative safety of the mission walls, in search of salvation from the incessant attacks of the Comanche. The Apache, too, have unleashed countless attacks on Comanche villages, killing men, women, and children, and taking any spoils and captives that they could. This cycle of violence is also not at all unique to the southern plains, but what is about to take place will be one of the few glimpses garnered by captive sources of the brutal realities of intertribal warfare. Unbeknownst to this Comanche band now traveling through these vast expanses, a group of Apache, also out on a hunting trip in hopes of fortifying their stock of meat for the winter ahead, is in the immediate vicinity, as the Comanche band, traveling in a group spread out over roughly a quarter of a mile, makes their way through a short expanse of hills and streams that dots the otherwise flat country. Both parties are woefully unaware of the other's presence. The Comanche's extended traveling line is bookended by their group of pack mules in the back and a younger group of warriors to the front who dash back and forth playfully as the rest of the party plods away. Lee and Spotted Leopard ride near the rear, near the mules. Though he is still figuratively bound in the role of a captive slave, for the first time in many weeks, Lee is able to enjoy relatively unfettered movement as his limbs are left untied in order to enable him to work. He even has some measure of assurance that, as the Comanches have not yet killed him as they had his companions, he might even be able to someday become an adopted member of the tribe, an incredibly rare circumstance for any fighting-age male prisoner. For a brief moment, Lee is able to afford himself a psychological reprieve from his current plight. Then, suddenly, the warriors near the front of the procession become visibly animated, some of them dashing back towards Spotted Leopard, and some making their way to the crest of a hill to their immediate left. The cry goes up from the young warriors at the front of the line. The Apache have been spotted, and an attack is underway. Now, there is no time to waste. The lives of every single member of this party of Comanche, including not only their prisoners, but their women and children, are now in immediate danger. The word travels to every warrior that the Apache are approaching from the opposite side of the hill to their left. and the men all now scramble to form a battle line atop the hill in order to receive the oncoming Apache charge. In his autobiography entitled 3 Years Among the Comanche, a narrative of a Texas Ranger, Nelson Lee gives his first-hand account of the beginning of the battle. The whole band dashed upon the hill, except for Spotted Leopard and myself, who remained with the mules in the rear, and on reaching the summit, deployed into the line. By this time, I heard the cry of, "The Apaches! The Apaches!" and knew at once there was hot work at hand. As yet, however, I had seen nothing of an enemy, and only drew the inference that there was one present from the cries that I had heard, and the general commotion that prevailed. In the course of 2 or 3 minutes after our line was formed on the ridge, the air was rent with the noise of the war whoop, and up the opposite ascent, at full speed, came the Apaches in a solid body like a black cloud. As they approached, a shower of arrows were discharged from both lines. Then they rushed upon each other in a hand-to-hand encounter. A vicious fight now unfolds, as the Comanche warriors know that they are the only line of defense between the attacking Apache and their own women and children. Though firearms are certainly not uncommon amongst native frontier tribes by this time in the 1850s, they are not possessed by a great many warriors on either side in this case. Thus, the combat at hand entails up-close and personal encounters fought with spears, clubs, shields, hatchets, and knives. The bloody, violent conflict unfolds with shocking speed and intensity, with the only rules of engagement being victory by any means necessary. The cries of the vanquished and the exhortations of the victors resound about the battlefield, seeming to drown out any and all other sounds in the vicinity. Lee's personal account of the battle continues. From the position I occupied, I had a fair unobstructed view of the battle. It was fierce and terrible. The horses reared and plunged and fell upon each other, their riders dealing blow for blow, and thrust for thrust, some falling from their saddles to the ground, and others trampling madly over them. The Comanches outnumbered the enemy. Nevertheless, they were forced to retreat, falling back down the hill almost to my position. But still, they were not pursued, the Apaches appearing to be content to hold possession of the ground. Soon, the tribe of Spotted Leopard again rallied and dashed once more back into the attack. If possible, this contest was severer, as it was longer than the first. Again, the first blow was given and returned. Again, horses and men intermingled in melee, stumbled, fell, rolled upon the ground, while the wide heavens resounded with their hideous shrieks and cries. My blood thrilled through my veins as I looked upon the scene. I had mingled in encounters fierce even as that, but never before in the midst of the hottest fight was I overcome with such a sense of terror. To be an inactive spectator of a battle is far more painful than to be a participator in it. As the Apache warriors continue their onslaught, and the Comanche fight to defend their families, Lee struggles with the odd dichotomy of his situation. As the lone captive observer, his account continues. I hoped devoutly during the engagement that the Comanches would be beaten, being impressed with the belief that if I should fall into the enemy's hands, my chances of escape would be increased. For I had often heard that the Apaches, though a most warlike nation, were more merciful to their prisoners than others of their race. But in this, I was disappointed. The Apaches at length gave way, disappearing beyond the ridge. Instead of pursuing their advantage, however, the Comanches hastily gathered up their dead and retreated towards the mountains we had crossed. As soon as they had left the ground, the Apaches again appeared upon the height and bore away their dead. It was a drawn battle. The Comanche have lost 17 of their own warriors in the fight, with Lee's account estimating that the Apache have likely lost approximately twice that number. The Comanche now commence with the unenviable task of burying their dead, as well as tending to their wounded. Amidst the carnage and sorrow, Lee recounts the Comanche approach to this grisly endeavor. The close of this eventful day was occupied in burying the slain, which ceremony was performed in their customary manner, except they seemed to chant the death song with more energy and feeling than on ordinary occasions. With them, death, at any time, even of the nearest and dearest of their kindred, is not regarded as an event to be deplored, but on the contrary, to be welcomed with rejoicing. But when a warrior dies on the field of battle, their joy and exultation knows no bounds, for their crude theology assures them that his departed spirit is, at once, caught up by the Great Spirit and borne to the region of everlasting and supreme felicity. After the dead are buried, the Comanches' lives, and their hunt for food, must continue. The band makes their way to their seasonal hunting grounds, seeing no more of the Apache along the way. Here, they will remain for 2 months, harvesting buffalo and camping on the open plains. By the next spring, a peace with the Apache will be struck. With the ever-increasing encroachment of American and Mexican settlers into their territories, the two tribes come to view a partnership affording each some form of mutual protection as a far better option to the continued intertribal slaughter. For his part, Lee will eventually escape and go on to continue his adventurous life on the Texas frontier for years to come, ultimately succumbing to an undisclosed illness in New York City on December 21, 1871. But the many tales of brutal intertribal warfare and unyielding violence between settlers and the native tribes of the American frontier, as well as the countless tales of conflict and combat from Nelson Lee's personal account of his life and times in Texas are, for tonight, other stories for other times. West Texas, 1876. Just as dawn begins to break, a pair of young Apache hunters lope their mounts towards the top of a ridge, being careful to move as quietly as possible, lest they disturb any game in the area. The young hunters are mere teenagers. One is a full-blood Apache named Bobo, riding a fine horse belonging to his father. The other is an adopted member of the tribe. A few years earlier, he had been a German-speaking farm boy on a central Texas farm not far from today's Mason, Texas. His name had been Herman Lehman, though he barely remembered that now. He had been kidnapped by the Apache with his younger brother Willie, taken while the boys were out watching sheep. The pair had suffered terrible abuse at the hands of the Apache, being starved, beaten, and driven without rest for long periods. Willie had managed to escape, but Herman had not. He had eventually been adopted by the Apache as one of their own. Life with the Apache, though, even once he had been adopted into an Apache family, had been difficult. Life for the Apache, and for any tribe in West Texas for that matter, was hard. The sparse landscape and unremitting conflict with Americans, Mexicans, and other tribes made for a perpetually hardscrabble, violent existence. But, at least for the time being, Herman was now, at least ostensibly, one of them. However, he was not fully Apache, and even his new name was quick to remind him of this every time he was addressed by it. His new name was Inda. It meant white boy. Regardless, Herman, or Inda, had thrown himself into the life of a preteen warrior in training under the often brutal tutelage of his adopted father, a chief named Carnoviste. Carnoviste had been the chief of the party who had initially kidnapped Herman and his younger brother from their family's farmstead. He had initiated the young boy into the brutal realities of Apache life before the raiding party had even made it back to their home village. Food on the trail could be scarce, and the luxury of cooking and eating meals while presumably being pursued was not one that could be afforded. Later in life, Herman would recall being force-fed the raw liver of a calf that the party had happened upon and slaughtered, as well as his repeated failure to keep the meal down. A few days later, the young Texan found his appetite less discriminating when the band discovered a few baby antelope that had been left alone when their parents had scattered at the approach of the oncoming Apache. The baby antelope were summarily scooped up and thrown into a leather sack as the Apache proceeded on to their campsite for the night. After several more hours of riding, they stopped and, for the first time in several days, afforded themselves the indulgence of a campfire. After they had the fire built and a sufficient bed of red-hot coals stoked, the antelope, some of whom were still alive, were thrown onto the fire whole to roast to the Apache's content. In his memoirs, 9 Years Among the Indians, linked to purchase in the description, Herman recalls his mix of admiration and horror when the antelope parents, known to track their young down should they wander off, showed up not far from the camp in an attempt to rescue their imperiled young.
The Apache quickly shot both, and soon a great feast was had. For almost everyone, it was the first real meal in a long while and was greatly appreciated. And thus life had continued on for Herman, as he transitioned his mindset and lifestyle from that of a young Deutschman on the Texas farm to that of an Apache warrior responsible for eking out a living for himself and his family in a land that offered little and took much. He had learned, though, how to ride, how to track, how to hunt, and how to fight. The Apache were capable of procuring water from places that seemed to not have seen rain in years. They were renowned for their ability to track animals and people in the dusty, rock-strewn expanses of their homelands. They were also held in high regard as warriors and feared as raiders in homesteads and hamlets from Utah to Mexico. However, the desert had not always been their home. They had once been the masters of the vast and bountiful expanses of current-day Texas and the southern plains. They had hunted the expansive buffalo herds, harvested from the pecan trees, camped in the meadows, and swam in the rivers and streams. Then, the Comanche had arrived. Over the course of a few decades, the newcomers to the southern plains, who had made their way down from the northern Rockies and made their martial ascent after mastering the newly available horse, had made it their business to systematically remove the Apache from what is modern-day central and southern Texas. The intensity and scope of the Comanche raids that swept into the Apache villages were unlike anything the Apache, or anyone else in Texas for that matter, had seen before. The Tonkawa, the Karankawa, the Caddo, the Waco, the Cheyenne, as well as the Spanish and later the Mexicans and Texans. Regardless of the target of their wrath, the accounts were strikingly and disturbingly similar. All fighting-age males not killed in defending their families would generally be summarily executed via any variety of torturous methods the Comanche employed over the years. Women would generally be assaulted and exploited, sexually and otherwise, and infants would be killed outright, as they posed too much trouble to a raiding party's egress back to their home territory. Children and preteens and some teens were, after a generally brutal induction process, adopted into the tribe, as Herman was with the Apache. The Comanche, in fact, have one of the most impure bloodlines of any tribe on record. Their male mortality rates were unusually high due to the frequency and ferocity of their combat, and their birth rates were relatively low, with miscarriages being a more common phenomenon among the perpetually horse-bound people. Raids would generally conclude with horses and usable goods being taken, and all homes and crops being burned. The Apache had perhaps suffered the wrath of the Comanche more than any other. Though many of the personal accounts would be lost to history, the sheer rapidity of the Apache retreat from their Texas homelands speaks to the ferocity of the attacks. But the Apache had managed to adapt and survive in their new lands. Though the game was less plentiful, it could still be procured, and thus Herman and Bobo had ventured out away from the relative safety of the camp on this morning. They assume, for all intents and purposes, that they are safe from Comanche attack, as they are already far west of the Comanche's typical range. Their only concern is not spooking any game in the area, and being able to find their way back to their village. Then the boys hear the sound of several hoofbeats coming their way. They are the only warriors who had left camp, and thus they know whoever is coming towards them is not from their village. Before the pair can question each other as to what the source of the noise might be, the answer is made all too apparent, as a large band of Comanche warriors suddenly crest the ridge the young Apache boys are at the bottom of. Their only option now is to flee back to their village and attempt to alert as many of their tribesmen as possible in order to marshal some sort of defense. Bobo's horse, fleet of foot and well-bred, turns and gallops back towards the village at full speed, his rider hugging tight to him by squeezing with his knees and hugging close to the horse's neck while staying low. Herman's mule, meanwhile, is not so obedient. The unfortunate animal has, by Herman's account, been beaten so severely for so long that it had become extremely skittish and even more obstinate than its nature had originally dictated. In this particular instance, as Herman urges the animal towards the Apache village and away from the oncoming Comanche, the mule begins to spin in tight circles rather than running in any direction. As the mule spins faster and faster, Herman calls out to Bobo, begging him to come back and help. But his pleas are to no avail, as Bobo, atop his fine mount, pays Herman no heed as he makes his way back in a full panic towards the Apache village. After a number of revolutions, the animal is struck in the hip by a Comanche arrow. This finally breaks the terrified mule from his panicked spin and sends him in a full gallop in the direction of the Apache village. Herman now hangs on for dear life, as the mule picks up more and more speed, finally passing Bobo. The terrified young man now cries out to Herman not to leave him, as his horse begins to tire and the Comanches gain ground. But, as Herman recalls in his own words, "If I had any intention of waiting, it was forlorn, for that dun mule was on the go. There was no stopping him." The mule, with Herman still clinging on to him, barrels through the Apache camp, knocking over women and children in its manic flee back to the village's horse herd, where, only minutes before there had been a placid camp with many Apache now just beginning to wake, there was now a scene of pure terror and calamity. Upon reaching the village's horse herd, Herman's mule begins to buck, attempting to dismount his rider and rejoin the perceived safety of its herd. Herman manages to safely dismount, jump on the back of another horse, and make his way back to the village. He arrives back just as the fight against the oncoming Comanches, a force Herman estimates to be roughly 40 warriors, is beginning in earnest. The Apache warriors have met the Comanche charge and managed to drive them back. As Herman scans the force of Apache warriors, loosing arrows and bullets upon the Comanche, he searches for the face of his hunting companion Bobo. But he is nowhere to be found. As arrows whiz all around, he notices a contingent of warriors pressing forward toward an area just outside the bounds of the village. Then, he sees the body of his friend, crumpled on the ground. His back is full of thick Comanche arrows, and he has been scalped. The young, carefree hunter who had taken to the wilderness with Herman just this morning was now gone. Unable to process the gravity of these events in the moment, Herman can only express rage as he joins the group of Comanche fighting their way forward to recapture the body of the young warrior. Herman later recounted the events in his memoirs. Every foot of ground was contested. The Comanche were nasty fighters, but we greatly outnumbered them. The battle began about 10 o'clock in the morning and raged most of the day. About sundown, the Comanches withdrew, leaving many of their comrades dead on the battlefield. Never tried to follow them, for 20 of our braves had gone to the happy hunting ground, while 8 more were writhing in pain, 4 of whom died that night in spite of the prayers and incantations of our medicine man. 1 more died the next day, but the other 3 recovered. Our dead were given a decent burial. Herman and his cohorts now moved back to the battlefield, still stinking of iron and slick with blood, to retrieve any usable weapons from the dead Comanche. Guns, bows, arrows, and shields are all collected, as are any horses that are not dead or wounded. The dead Comanche warriors are afforded no respect. They are gathered up and thrown into a hole in the ground, left to the ravages of the wolves, coyotes, and buzzards. The Apache then hurriedly pack their things and break camp, moving north at a rapid pace in case there were more Comanche in the area to be avoided. Scouts are sent out in every direction to scour the landscape for any Comanche in hiding. Soon, 2 Comanche spies are discovered. One is shot and killed outright upon discovery, while the other is captured and hauled in to be tortured. Colonel Viste, Herman's adopted father and the village's chief, cuts holes in both the Comanche's arms, strings a rawhide cord through them, and hangs the warrior up from a tree, leaving him to expire as the Comanches move on. Herman would later recall, with no small amount of disgust, how an old Apache squaw, whose nose had been cut off for infidelity, had felt bad for the Comanche and later snuck back and cut him down. Such soft-heartedness was seen as a reprehensible trait in these harsh environs. Finally, the party arrives at a spring some 60 miles from their previous encampment. They stay for a few days, trying to come to terms with their intermittent, overwhelming grief and rage. One morning, soon after arriving to the spring, an old Apache man wakes in a sweat. He stirs his family awake and tells them of a terrifying vision he has just seen in his dreams. They then report the vision to Colonel Viste, who listens intently as the old man describes his nightmare in detail. He says he has seen a great horde of Comanches chasing after them, and that soon these Comanche would be upon them. A collective pang of terror now sweeps through the village, and the elders come together to hold a council. All day, the Apache abstain from food and drink, and discuss what course of action they might take next. The majority of the Apache advocate for simply packing up and leaving the area altogether, rather than risk greater losses against a foe that had hounded them so incessantly for so long. Thus, Colonel Viste and the rest of the village elders agree to pack up and move the village again, making as much haste as possible. The horses and mules are again hurriedly loaded, and the Apache move west. They move along quietly, doing their best to be as discreet as possible in this landscape that offers little in the way of tactical cover. They travel for 20 miles and begin to think that perhaps all of this was much ado about nothing. So much effort spent for the ravings of a sleep-deprived old man. Then, as though they have stepped onto a hornet's nest, the Comanche are everywhere. Somehow, where once the horizon had been bare, are now dozens of Comanche warriors coming at the Apache full bore, loosing arrows all the while. In the minutes that followed, utter devastation was wrought on the small Apache band. 40 of their warriors were killed, most of their women and children were taken captive by the Comanche, and all of their horses, food, and equipment was stolen. The Comanche, for their part, also suffered significant losses at the hands of the Apache, as the Apache had, in this particular fight, more rifles at hand than did their opponents. By Herman's later estimation, roughly 100 Apache warriors, along with 6 women, are able to escape on foot. For a full month, they wander the desolate landscape, barely surviving on what little food and water they could find. Finally, Herman and the other survivors cross paths with another band of Comanche, 150 warriors strong and well armed. They inform this band of the horrors they have suffered over the past several weeks at the hands of the Comanche, and a call is put out, all across Apache territory, for the bands to meet at a known spot on the plains, a dry lake bed known to the entire tribe. As Apache scouts carry the word from camp to camp, warriors begin to pour into the lake bed location from areas as far away as Utah, Arizona, and Mexico. As warfighters stream into the camp, they find it a hive of activity. Herman and all of his fellow warriors are hard at work, making arrows, hardening spear points, cleaning rifles, and reinforcing shields. The Apache had decided that they would no longer bear the brunt of Comanche wrath. The time had come for their people to unite and reap their proverbial pound of flesh from the Comanche transgressors who had, for so long and so egregiously, abused them. They had, many of them felt, reached the point of no return. There was no longer room for both they and the Comanche to exist, and they would now do their best to eradicate them outright and reclaim the homeland that was rightfully theirs. Hatred for the Comanche is so intense that even the women and children are drilled, again and again, in the handling of weapons and potential paths of egress, should their fathers and brothers be overtaken in the great battle to come. For the Apache and Comanche, a time of reckoning is at hand. Even the legendary chiefs, Victorio and Geronimo,
come to the camp, ready to make war. It is Victorio himself who volunteers to lead a band of his most trusted scouts out into the west in a preliminary search for any Comanche in the territory. But as days pass, and as more and more Apache pour into the camp, and the pace of preparation becomes even more frantic, there is still no sign of Victorio's scouting party. Finally, the legendary chief straggles back into the camp, barely hanging on to his mount. All of his companions have been killed, he says, and the Comanche now know that the Apache are again encroaching into their territory. A council is again held, where Victorio, Geronimo, Carnoviste, and other chiefs all give their opinions on what to do next. Victorio advocates for peace with the Comanche. He says, "I fear not the Comanche myself, neither am I afraid of their allies, the Kiowa. But these tribes are strong among themselves and greatly outnumber us. Besides, the whites furnish them with guns and powder and lead to help exterminate our tribe. The white man is the Indian's enemy, and the Indians must quit fighting among themselves and all go together to fight the palefaces. While I was gone, on a previous trip, I saw as many palefaces as there are sprigs of grass on the plains or stars in the sky, and if we continue to fight each other, we will all be exterminated by the white men." Red Wasp, another chief, argued that we do not fear the cowardly palefaces. They have robbed us of our hunting grounds. They have destroyed our game. They have brought us disease. They have stirred up discord among our own race. They have intimidated our braves. They have made profligates of our children, reprobates of our wives, and destroyed our traditions. They have wrought despair and desolation to our tribes, and for my part, I am ready to fight until I fall. As to the Comanche, our grievances are great, and the cause of war is just, and I'll be glad to kill them when they come. Kill them as they kill our companions. Kill them. Kill them. And if we must die, let us fight to the bitter end. I want to fight." Finally, it is decided that a truce with the Comanche will be attempted. If it can be achieved, perhaps the two tribes can finally present a unified front against the centuries-long incursions of the whites, be they Texans, Americans, Mexicans, or Spanish. The next day, the Apache, under a white flag of truce raised high on a pole, make their way to within 3 miles of the Comanche camp. Soon, a Comanche warrior comes riding toward them. He circles the Apache party from a safe distance, whooping and taunting them, waving a black shield over his head. This is a challenge of war to the death, with all the vanquished being killed, be they warriors, women, or children. Now, the moment of truth arrives. Should the Apaches send out their own warrior, holding up a red shield, the invitation to battle would be accepted, and the fight would unfold. But instead, much to the Comanche's surprise, the Apache rider comes forward unarmed, still flying the white flag of truce. The Comanche, still incredulous, make signs for 6 of their men to meet 6 of the Apache at a halfway point between the two parties. 6 Apache men are selected to go forward, and they ride out to meet the Comanche. The Comanche, for their part, agree to make peace so long as the offending Apache who had tortured their tribesmen was handed over to be dealt with as they saw fit. The Apache emissaries, very much aware that the offending chief the Comanche were referring to was the very much alive and well Carnoviste, informed the Comanche that, unfortunately, the Apache who had so mistreated their warrior was unfortunately killed in the earlier battle. Disappointed, but unwilling to pursue the matter further, the Comanche agree to drop the issue altogether and pursue a unified, mutually beneficial peace. Upon this precarious falsehood, a truce is agreed to. The women and children who had been taken captive in the earlier raid are returned to their Apache families, and many tears of joy and celebration are the order of the day. Some of the Apache women even agree to, or are forced to, depending on the account, stay with their captors in order to solidify the relations between the two tribes via marital bonds. They are adopted into the tribe immediately, as is the old woman with no nose who cut down the Comanche. Herman, for his part, is not sad to see her go. Ultimately, Herman credits Victorio for opening the door to peace between the two tribes. Though their plans for unity and retaliation would never ultimately materialize, the diplomacy and political dexterity shown by Victorio in this instance are without doubt belonging to a rarefied strata of achievement and leadership. And while this particular tale ended well, the times before and after in which conflicts such as these ended in untold bloodshed and suffering are too numerous to mention. And the tales of young Herman Lehman, who would eventually kill a medicine man in retaliation for the murder of Carno Viste and escape to join the Comanche, do not end here either. But for now, those are other stories for other times.
Thank you again for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes, as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the join button below. And we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.